All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Soccer Performance Podcast. Today, we're sitting with Dana John. I'm going to let him introduce himself better, but we're excited to finally get him on. We've been trying to work out a conversation for a little bit of time. So, Dana, thank you for coming by. We appreciate your time. And why don't you kind of let us know who you are a little bit?
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. My name's Dana John Heimbecker. I'm based out in Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada. I'm a manual therapist, athletic development coach, soccer skills trainer, and so I basically work with youth athletic players, or I work with youth soccer players. I've kind of specialized over the past couple years per se. Previously, I dove into kind of the mobility world. I worked for functional range conditioning. I learned under Dr. Spina, which is a world-renowned manual therapist. And basically, that was a lot of specialization in terms of joint optimization, neurological control, body control, and those components there, which I highly value that I'm trying to kind of insert right now into the youth soccer world.
Nice. So you and Mario connected through that world, right? Through the FRC world.
Yeah.
Let's start there.
Yeah. Basically my background playing, I played NCAA Division I at Marshall University. This is back in the early 2000s. Kind of go through that realm. Had a couple of professional trials in Germany, Belgium, a couple of trials in the US, had a little issues with work permits. I was about 24, 25 at the time. So I was a little bit later in my career. I just kind of decided to dive into training others. It kind of started off with soccer, and then it started off with a lot more hockey players. And then I took functional range conditioning probably back in 2014, 2015, probably when it was one of the first courses. Basically what functional range conditioning is joint mobility, functional control, and range strength, all the components that have gained a lot of popularity now. And I learned under Dr. Spina, I would say about 2014, 2015. And then he named me as an instructor. So I started traveling around the world with him. And then that's how I met Mario. So Mario, I believe he took the course maybe about 3-4 pre-COVID year, maybe about 3-4 years ago. And he was currently in England. I think he said that you were in England studying a lot of Prem teams there. And we obviously resonated and talked footy. And we kind of realized that there's a huge niche or huge need for joint optimization in the soccer performance world.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for sure. And to add to that, so Dana and I agreed a lot where, we saw, and it's universal and it doesn't matter where, like what I saw in England, what we both saw in Canada, what we see, in Dana's work with kind of pros and Dana's traveled around everywhere, the issues we see are actually really universal. And especially in soccer, Dana, we'd like to get you to dive in deeper, but I mean, just in improving injury resiliency in players, ankles, knees, hips, like by keeping them healthy and on the pitch, we can prevent a lot of injuries. And there's also a lot of performance benefits as well. I was wondering if you could kind of touch on that, but also maybe, common issues you see with soccer players, youth and what you see there.
Yeah. So we'll start off with youth. Youth, I mean, technique is everything. So depending on the age, you work on the technical ability because you got to think about you're a soccer player and you're trying to develop soccer technical ability, but then you got to look at what are the requirements of being a human. Okay. So usually when you specialize, you ingrain yourself into certain paths. As you grain yourself into those certain paths, the more you do it, the more ingrained it is. So a good example would be, say, for example, you get a 10-year-old, they're training, overtraining, training, overtraining, and then they start to limit their movement options. With joint mobility training, or let's just call it mobility training, you're allowed to give them, or you're training to give them more options. So more degrees of freedom. So more degrees of freedom allows them to have more options on the field. A good saying that I like is isolate. So you isolate a joint action, you integrate the joint action with technical ability. And then when you're on the field, you improvise. So improvise, it's subconscious. You don't really think about it. You just kind of move. And those things want to be basically unconscious competence. So you want things to be second nature. You want things to happen without thinking about it per se. So with the kids, if I take a 10-year-old kid or I have an 8-year-old kid, whatever, usually that age that I like to work with, I'm going to basically try to really focus on the technical ability. But then when you start to get a little bit older, let's say about 16, 18 years old, they should already have that technical ability. So what are things that you can do to improve that? So obviously, like you said, Mario, injury resiliency, injury mitigation, because let's call a spade. I mean, if you're injured, you can't get better. And if you can't get better, you're not going to obviously improve at your craft. So common areas, obviously, you have ankle, so inversion sprains. With females, you have ACLs, hamstrings, low back. All those things can be mitigated. And when I use the word mitigated, that means you can decrease the severity of injury because you can't prevent injury. So there's going to be a time that you're going to roll your ankle, and it just comes down to the equation: how much load can that ankle absorb? And if the force is more than the ankle can absorb, then you're going to be injured, but it's going to be correlated on maybe a second, third, or maybe a first degree sprain. Okay, so that's basically what mitigation means. So instead of being out for a week, instead of being out for maybe a month, you're out for a couple weeks or maybe a couple days. Okay, so that's the number one thing. I think longevity is a huge thing because that can be helped with injury mitigation. And the ways that you can train that are tissue specific, more or less, and training in those positions that you are commonly injured. So ankle inversion, I'm sure you see sometimes on my stories. I'm always trying to tease ankle inversion with my students just because there's going to be a day that their ankle is going to go into that position, and you always regret not training the position you get injured
in. Yeah, cool. Makes a lot of sense. And for anyone kind of listening, look up Dana's page on Instagram. You'll see a lot of, I guess, unconventional things that you would see in normal Instagram training, where he is kind of forcing or slowly loading the ankle in like a lateral sprained position, if you will, because the goal is to get that tissue stronger. And as Dana said, to hopefully minimize the severity of that. So, a very interesting perspective, because traditional strength and conditioning is, everything's in alignment, foot's always flat and neutral and everything's like that. But reality is sport is chaotic, and we want to prepare for that. Let's go into a little more about what you're doing now. So you apply a lot of that with all your clients and stuff, but now you're also working a lot with Niagara OPDL. And so now you're trying to combine it all. I see a lot of speed, power, and plyo work. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? How you kind of structure the training in a week, and if you have much free reign to do so?
Yeah, I got pretty well free range to do what I want. So obviously you have qualities that you want to cross off, and we're not trying to reinvent the wheel by any means. So you have technical ability, so obviously the value of first touch, passing, receiving, all those components there. Then you obviously have speed, explosiveness, change of direction, plyometrics in multi-direction, single leg, broad jump emphasis, which would be horizontal, and then vertical emphasis. So you can kind of blend those things. I do like to do a lot of barefoot training. I feel that shoes mask a lot of sensory input with the feet. So if I'm able to get a recovery session or even a sprinting session, I'll get some of my students or some of the teams to go on the grass barefoot. Obviously, it sounds a little woo-woo, but there is some literature supporting the fact of grounding. So the fact that bare feet connecting to grass does help with inflammation, does help with lowering inflammation within the body. But also, too, you got to look at, if your first touch is everything, if you can't sense and feel, then there is a distortion or a distortion within what you're trying to feel. So the bare feet So bare feet resonated with me completely when I'm like, okay, you look at a footy player, what are things that you want to improve? And obviously first touch is everything. So with your first touch and your technical ability, you want to be able to feel the ball. You want to be able to have good control of the ball. If you look at Brazilians, I mean, half of them can't even afford shoes, but it is a beach culture. They're in their bare feet all the time. I mean, there's a story about Ronaldinho. He couldn't even afford shoes till he was like 11 or 12. And obviously one of the best players in the world ever. Sense of touch, everything from there. So to basically come back to your question is there's certain pillars that I want to obviously cross off. Some of the unconventional things would be the barefoot training, but some of the conventional things are, you know, your sprinting, hill work, the acceleration work. The way I would organize it, depending on the team, I feel that females need a little bit more need of that unconventional loading through the medial and lateral knee. Males, I find at like 13, 14, a little bit more speed explosiveness. Obviously, still want to load those certain areas, but you got to look at your demographics. Also, too, if I'm dealing with kids, adolescence is another thing too. I find that females hit adolescence a little bit earlier than boys, around that 12 to 14 years of age. So those are things I want to take into consideration in terms of maturity level, physical maturity level, and emotional maturity level. Yeah, that basically kind of summarizes what I do.
Yeah, that's very
cool. Would you so obviously there's a lot of qualities being trained. You know, we have everything you mentioned: speed, power, change direction, agility, joint health, and all that. Can you run us through like a rough guideline what that session would look like? You know, is it an hour session? You know, let's say you got the under 14s,
yep,
or the under 16s. Let's say, is it an hour session? And you know, roughly how would that look like from start to finish? Where does that kind of joint health and mobility work fit in that session?
So there's two types of sessions that I would teach depending on load. So we have a recovery regeneration session. So say, for example, a team plays on a Sunday and I have them on a Monday. We're obviously going to do recovery and regen. That's when we're going to do long kind of static holds in certain positions, hips, hamstrings, more of a recovery base kind of component to get the blood flow, circulation, and all those things going, basically get the junk out of the body from the game. And then the other component for sports performance, we start off with some rhythm coordination drills, so low intensive plyometrics just to get the body temperature up. Then I would implement your CARs. So CARs stands for controlled articular rotations, which is basically working the joint around the outer limits of range of motion. I would work specifically spine, hips, knees, ankles, and toes. You can get away with it by just doing essentially the spine, hips, knees, and ankles, not necessarily the shoulder and scapula area, unless I'm working with a goalkeeper. And then from there, I would go a little bit more positional isometrics. So positional isometrics just to kind of load specific areas within the body. 90-90 is a fantastic position because it crosses off a lot of boxes, but I do like split stance holds just to load that back anterior thigh. So load that area. So I like isometrics just to kind of prime the nervous system, get them in positions. And then from there, you got your classic dynamic warm-up, movement prep, and then that bleeds into your plyometrics, your more intense stuff, your high CNS-driven stuff, band-resisted sprints, sled sprints, hill sprints, all those components there. So basically, you start off easy, and then you ramp up, and then your cool down. I'm a huge component of the ankles. So sitting on your toes, sitting on your feet, which is different types of motion through the toes, and then being barefoot. That's a huge thing for the cool down component. So that's how I would basically structure it. So rhythmic coordination, you get your mobility stuff kind of after that, you get your general prep, then you get your dynamic warm up. After your dynamic warm up, you get your plyos. After your plyos, you get your sprints, change of direction stuff, and then you start to cool down from there. Usually I get about 45 minutes to an hour. I know it's tough to fit that in, but also too, it's getting a read of the team and getting a read of what they need. So if I have a 14-year-old group, you can kind of get away with a lot with kids because they're very malleable based on their inputs. So as long as you're doing the right things, i.e. maintaining their range of motion out of what they usually encounter on the field. So you got to think about a lot of hip flexion, a lot of hip extension, but there's very minimal hip abduction or hip abduction. So those things I would want to work, and also rotation. So your classic warm up with the hip motion is mobilizing the hip and warming up the hip, but it's not actually working the hip on outer ranges of motion. So if you look up what CARs are, hip CARs are basically working the outer limits of range of motion, where you're using tension to achieve that range. Because if you can master the tension, you can master the range of motion. And that's why we call it usable ranges of motion, because there's a big difference. And this is kind of in our world, Mario, it's there's a misunderstanding of really what mobility training is. And real mobility training is end range strength, and that can be done in different ways. That can be done through positional isometrics. That can be done through end range holds. There's various ways that you can skin the cat, per se.
And then I want to ask you something, just so that a player, I mean, sometimes I think when it's about the physical side, it's difficult to get the buy-in, because it looks a little bit untraditional, or it doesn't look fancy like a technical drill might. So what would you say to a player when you're introducing them to that type of work? What is it like? What is it? Where is it that they'll be able to see these, scenarios where they're able to use their full range of motion, right? Because I can imagine a player might be a little bit confused as to, like, why am I really doing this?
100%. So there's a couple ways. Usually you have a buy-in when they're hurt, unfortunately. Usually an injury is something that they're like, okay, maybe I have to do something different about my training. Let's take a hamstring, for example. Those are common areas. When you do a passive range hold, so basically bring your full knee into flexion and you hold that position without using your hands, that is kind of an aha moment to realize, okay, well, maybe I'm weak in these areas. And then we can kind of relate that back to injury. That's one way to get a buy-in. Another thing too, Juan, is like the older you are, so I know you deal with a lot of pro guys, they're stuck in their ways. That worked for them, that got them there. It takes a certain personality, when I've worked with pros in the past, in order to be open and receptive to new things. Because you're absolutely right. It's like, okay, this is the traditional way of thinking. It worked for me. It got me there. But there's always that like 1 or 2% that you can improve. So if you're doing the same thing over and over again and you're expecting the same results, that's insanity, right? So what we want to do is try to educate them and say, well, listen, if you want to have longevity through your career, that's number one. You want to mitigate injury. These are areas that are common that you may get injured in. And usually injury is kind of that selling point. But when you get older guys that sell, or older players, the sell is harder. When you get kids at 10 years old and they get the buy-in, that's my ideal student, right? You get a 10-year-old kid that just loves the game, and you're just like, hey man, or hey, with female, you're like, okay, we're gonna work on your technical ability, but these are things that are gonna help your technical ability. What I find sometimes when you teach a younger kid, let's say kicking with the laces, for example, so you tell them lock their ankle, and then you actually assess their plantar flexion, and you say, okay, show me your active plantar flexion, and it's like this. And it's like, okay, well, no wonder you can't lock your ankle. You don't have that range in it by itself. So that's another thing too. You kind of get those, you relate it back to technique, especially with younger kids, why they can't achieve that range of motion, or why their technical ability is not accessible to them on the field. With pro guys, it's way harder. It takes a special athlete to be open and receptive to that. I always think like pro athletes have a lot of cooks in the kitchen. They train with multiple different people, tells them multiple different things. Sometimes they want the sexiest exercises to do, but really it's the specific inputs that they're going to send to their body that are going to give them specific outputs. I like a barefoot component. So intrinsic foot control is basically the ability to move the toes. So I tell someone to take their socks off and say, hey, can you lift your big toe? And usually there's a little bit of lag. They might be able to, but it's not as clean as I want it. So basically big toe extension. That is a teaching moment, because you're like, hey, listen, like if you want to improve your first touch, you can keep working on your technique. That's fine. But if you don't improve the hardware of your body, the software is not going to run as optimally. And I always like to use analogies because that kind of runs home. So you look at a car analogy, for example, if you keep running the car without taking care of the parts are going to deteriorate. Okay, especially if you keep racing the car, per se. when you look at an FRC perspective, which is basically taking a joint by joint approach, you run it through the lens of a soccer player and you say, listen, your first touch is the most important thing. The ability of you to feel the ball on your foot is going to translate to how good your first touch is. Being in your bare feet is super important, and being able to move your toes are super important. I know barefoot training is gaining a lot of popularity now, rightfully so. I think it's super important because you look at, I was taught like your feet are no different than your hands, and think about how your sense of touch would be on your hands if you wore mittens all the time. So you're wearing socks. And it really resonated with me when I started working with soccer players. I'm like, man, this is huge, because think about the sense of touch with your hands if you're wearing mittens all the time and then you try to text, right? It's just the touch is not there. So with the feet, that's your bread and butter, that's your sword, that's your tool. So yeah, I mean, I know I kind of go on tangents, but kind of go back to your question, Juan. With pro guys, it's a difficult sell, 100%. But there's certain teaching moments that that may resonate with them and may not. Usually the barefoot one is also to, let's say, passive range holds. So basically passive range hold, say you got your classic hip flexion, so you're here. Okay. So classic, right? But then you're like, okay, well, can you hold this with no hands? And usually some of them bend, they cheat, they compensate. I'm like, okay, well, on the field, you can't do this, right? But on the field, you may need this movement option to bring the heel or bring the hip into hip flexion, okay? And the example I was talking about with knee flexion per se, so I'm heeling towards the butt. Everyone does this, right? So this is passive range, okay? And my ability to hold my heel towards my butt here is my active range. 9 times out of 10, people will cramp here. It's more or less weakness through the hamstring, and it's the ability to control this knee flexion here. You look at world-class sprinters on their gait, their heels essentially, they got full knee flexion there. But that is, yeah, with them, obviously the world-class, they have accessible to that range motion.
I really like the barefoot stuff. I mean, I never thought about it from the perspective that you're bringing, and you look like, for example, you see a kid playing on the street in Brazil barefoot, it's normal, and then you take your socks off in a gym and it's a little like, what are you doing here, right? And then it makes sense from a perspective over time. If you're a kid who's from the ages of whatever, as soon as you start to play and you're in a country where that's just, number one, obviously it's usually due to the weather, right? And number two is due to means of income, but it's the common denominator is they're very crafty, they're very skillful. I don't even think they realize, obviously, let me play barefoot so that I can improve these abilities. But if you are able to kind of get a player to understand that, you don't have to be in those extreme conditions to do those things, I think there's a lot of value in that. What do you think, Mayor?
Yeah, no, that was a really interesting point to me, and once again, something I never considered. But even like, because I guess people in strength and conditioning world kind of know that, shoes over time are bad for the feet, and you do lose that sensory component. So by retraining that, it makes sense. Like, and Dana said, first touch is everything. And, the higher the level, the faster the pace, the better your first touch has to be under pressure as well. If you can just improve the sensory input, your feet, which could potentially improve your first touch by 5-10%, that's a win. But I also want to talk to Dana mentioned specific inputs, and I want to talk about that term specificity because, and Juan, you mentioned before, like, it looks unconventional. In a way, everyone wants this specific training where it looks specific, it looks exact to what something is on the field, and try to replicate that in the gym. But nothing is more specific than soccer itself. So playing small-sided games, 1v1s, whatever, that is the most specific you can get. So by trying to like replicate something in the gym with the ball, like with the weights in a workout or something, would be ridiculous. But Dana is saying, okay, we're doing a specific input. It looks nothing like the sport, right? He's training the barefoot, or he's training his hip to get in these ranges. These are specific inputs done on the body so that he can take that tool onto the pitch. So it doesn't look specific to the sport, but it is relevant to the sport. I just want to kind of bring some clarity to that. And understanding, because people at home, they always want something specific.
No, and
And
that's a good
then
point.
the hip stuff, like Dana, you're talking about the hip. You're talking about those ranges you want. I think you mentioned to me in the past as well. You're talking to a player and you're like, okay, well, you have no hip internal rotation. So when Dana was in that position, from there, can we rotate the hip? And that's important for, can you get over the ball for when you strike a volley? Because you want to hit the ball and obviously not smash it over the net, but you want to be able to get over the ball in a volley. That is just one example. But having these hip ranges, having these movement options and this variability is overlooked and super important. And none of it looks specific, but it's actually very relevant to soccer. Just something I wanted to touch on.
No, that's a good
Completely.
point.
Yeah, go ahead, Juan. Sorry.
No, I think it's a good way to look at it. I mean, I just think off the top of my head, right? Like, I don't think players understand. Like, let's say a ball is played in and the ball comes into the box and you got to jump and it's in that awkward height that's not quite there for your head, but it's not quite low enough for your feet, and you got to raise your hip in a way that's uncommon, right? But there is a one moment opportunity where we all know it, right? It's a game of chances. So the value of being able to have that availability there, to me, is where you look at it from a player and say, okay, yeah, this is I'm doing this not because it's directly relevant to the field, but it indirectly gives me the availability to have that skill. I look at a guy like, and you look top strikers, but I can think of like a guy like Haaland right now scoring so many goals, and it's obviously different methods, but he's always in the box getting a body part on the ball, and it's impressive, right? I think there's a lot of work behind that. It's not just his soccer ability, right?
And Mario hit it on the nose, the variability. So the more options you have, the more variability you have. So when you're on the field, it's chaos, it's all improvisation. So it may not look specific, but it's specific for your joint. Okay, so more specificity you can have through your joint, i.e., better range of motion. The better range of motion, the more control you can create through that range of motion, and the more control you can create through that range of motion, the better ability you can control the ball, hands down. When you run it through the lens of technical ability, sure, there's certain things, like Mario said, hips are obviously super important on the way that you move, and also the way that you can manipulate the ball in the air, also the way that you can manipulate the ball on the ground. With the barefoot stuff, 100% relating that back to the Brazilians, that's a perfect example, because you can't feel what you can't sense. And if your first touch is all about feeling, it makes complete sense to be more barefoot more often. When I have a kid that I'm teaching, maybe like an 8-year-old, I'll get them in their bare feet because they're not going to kick that ball improperly, right? They're going to be in their bare feet. And if they kick it with their toe, it's going to hurt. And then they're not going to do that again. So that's another moment last year when it kind of resonated with me when I'm trying to teach an 8-year-old how to strike the ball properly. I'm like, okay, they're obviously not getting the cues that I'm saying. I'm like, okay, well, let's go barefoot. And then as they went barefoot, it almost immediately fixed it, because subconsciously it's like, okay, I don't want to kick it with my toe. I want to hit it with the right part of my foot. I'm going to feel with the right part of my foot. And if you can feel, then your technical ability, or if you can sense and feel, then your technical ability is going to improve drastically. And then, yeah, back to what Mario said with the specificity, 100%. There's nothing more than playing your sport. That's sport specific. Sure, you may want to replicate us and isolate certain things that you may incorporate on the field, 100%. But balancing on a Bosu and working on your volleys, I always say when you try to chase too many qualities, you're not developing one quality well. So are you developing balance, or are you developing your technical ability? So when you basically think about bandwidth per se, and you only have so much bandwidth to give, if you spread that bandwidth into, working, balance on a Bosu with volleys, with a vision blocker on per se, like you're just spreading those qualities too thin and you're not developing one. So why not just work on your first touch and do it at a high intensity? And then when you're working on your balance, work on your balance and do it at a high intensity. And I know we both agree on this one, and one of your posts on intensity, and maybe we can talk about that, but this is the number one thing. I mean, if you want to get better, you need to train at a high intensity. That intensity needs to obviously be a shorter duration. But the only way to really ingrain technique and skill is at a high intensity. And at that high intensity, you got to realize that when you're on the field and you're playing, I mean, it's an old saying, and it still stands the test of time, is you need to practice like you play. And I think that's a big thing. So if someone's training by themselves, you need to train at a high intensity in order to make sure those skills are ingrained, that you can apply them on the field.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And I think it's important to kind of conclude on the note of, we're not telling players to train barefooted every day, everywhere they go, with every drill. I hope that that's a main message. We're not saying go to a field, right? And now everything that you do is with no shoes on. The point is to develop those qualities. I love the fact that you said that. I never really thought about that. With a young kid, right? If you're going to kick the ball with your toes barefoot, you're probably going to kick it once and you're never going to do it again. That's something that I think it's a tool, right? And it's not fancy. What's fancy? Let's set out, a balance board or whatever, and let's distract. Let's get a lot of things going on, and it's for me, it's at least let's take a young 8-year-old. If you can get your 10 minutes of keep ups done now barefoot before you go to your training or at your training or whatever, and then you do your normal session, you tie your boots on and you train with intensity, sorry. I think that's where we're trying to go. The barefoot stuff, right? The cars adds to the core package, right? It gives you all these extra possibilities, right? No, I thought that was a great point, Dana.
100%. No, you're absolutely right, Juan. We're not saying, be bare feet all the time. I always tell my students, when you're around the house, no shoes and socks. So always that's a low hanging fruit. There's no need that you need to have your shoes and socks around or slippers around the house. Be in your bare feet. Okay. And like you said too, 10 minutes to keep up with barefoot, play off the wall. It doesn't need to be, every training session, like you said. That's basically what we're saying, 100%. Another key factor is the basics. I mean, tell me a world-class player that is not fundamentally good at the basics. Luka Modric, Toni Kroos, they're not necessarily fast and explosive. They're not necessarily powerful like Haaland, but their basics and their fundamentals are huge. And there was a saying that really resonated with me, is the base, or the top of the pyramid is only as wide as the base. So if you look at your base is your fundamentals. How good is your first touch? How good is your passing? How good is your awareness? How can you scan? All those things have stood the test of time. And those are the fundamentals that I love to ingrain with my students, because it's not the flashy things. It's not the triple step overs. It's not the rainbow flicks. It's not those things that really get a player to the next level. It's the fundamentals that really lay that down. So the message that I would want to say, and one of my colleagues said, be brilliant at the basics. The basics are number one, and you can't get bored of them. If you get bored of the basics, then we're just entertaining our students. And I'm not an entertainer, I'm a trainer, and I'm not meant to, and sometimes social media really distorts our image as trainers, the flashy, sexy exercises, but really it's the fundamentals and the basics. Show me a 10-year-old player that can pass with both feet, that can receive the ball in different areas, can manipulate the ball with different surfaces of the foot, can strike the ball with the laces. Give me that player in comparison to one that can, juggle 3,000 times and do rainbows around the worlds, all that stuff.
Yeah, well put. Very well put. Mario, conclude us, wrap us up, man.
No, I think we dissected a lot, and talking about something abstract like mobility training and all this stuff. But I think Dana did a really good job at connecting why that's important, how it, transfers to not just, of course, things I mentioned before, injury resilience and all that, but also, applications into on the pitch and technical stuff. So I thought that was really cool. And I hope people learn that and take value from that. So with that, Dana, so if people want to learn more about this, drop your Instagram, and where can they find you? I know you're based out of Niagara, but you do travel quite a bit. Like you've done a few camps and stuff. So perhaps
this past year I dove back into the soccer world. So I kind of removed myself from it a little bit. I mean, this country's a little bit frustrating with soccer development. So this past year, I really was like, you know what? I want to be back in the game. I want to teach. I want to combine my previous knowledge of mobility, body control, strength conditioning, sport performance, and then integrate that with technical ability and start really working with the grassroots soccer players. My Instagram is DGH Perform. I'm pretty active on there, just promoting stories and kind of through the lens of soccer and mobility training. Currently, I'm in the works of developing mobility for footballers, which will be an online platform that I would like to present to the world more or less on certain things that they can do in order to improve their body control, injury mitigation, improve certain things that will complement their technical abilities. So you have, let's say, the software of your technique, and then you have the hardware of your body. There's ways that you can improve the hardware of your body that are going to improve the running the software. So you take the individual parts, you take the ankles, the toes, the feet, whatever, knees, hips, and then you basically optimize those to the best of their ability. Then you practice your technical ability and things grow much better. Instead of just trying to run the software without improving the hardware in an isolated motion, it's going to work much more efficiently and effectively when you do that way. So so that will be an online platform that will be geared towards footballers. And it will be probably in the fall this year. So I'm kind of in the works right now of getting some video content, compiling things that will be either classes that you can do on demand, or it will be package based, which will be, say, for example, ankles, knees, hips, and it will be kind of categorized based on your individual needs, based on maybe previous injury history or certain things based on an assessment where you're lacking in active and passive ratios.
Yeah, that's exciting, man. And I think we're both big advocates of what you're doing. So when that's out, I'm going to encourage a lot of my players to give it a chance. So that's exciting. And again, just want to thank you for taking the time to sit with us. I want to thank anybody that's listening. Episode 14 with Dana. I think that was awesome. I think it's full of valuable information. And let's hopefully we can do this again.
100%, guys. I really appreciate you having me on. That's awesome. Great conversation.
All right, guys. I appreciate it. Thanks, boys. Everybody listening.
Thanks, guys. Good chat.
The next one.